now we're going to make a splint on the forearm and hand and thumb, and it's a splint in the position of safe immobilisation. We just call them POSI splints, position of safe immobilisation, just for short. We'd use this for infections, if you've got a big swollen hand that's infected and you'd need to keep it in a good position, or for fractures that you want to keep in a good position, or for any major trauma that's swollen. You'd just want to keep them in that position of safe immobilisation where the ligaments are on a stretch so the hand doesn't get too stiff. So this splint we thought we'd show you because it can be adapted for other things. So if you had extensor tendon repairs, you can also use it for an early active mobilisation regime, and you could also adapt it if you had a patient with scar releases after burns or after any sort of contracture, gunshot wound contracture of the hand, anything like that. You can adapt it to try and keep those releases stretched out on the flexor side of the hand. So that's what we would use this splint for.
We're going to do a hand splint next, hand and forearm with a thumb. This was the plastic that we used for the leg splint. And the nice thing about this material is that you can cook it up many times, endlessly. So I'm going to take these bits of Velcro off. You can actually use those again as well, so I'll put them back.
Is there any time that you wouldn't be able to use this material again?
Yeah, I mean, if it's become beyond it, if it's broken, for example, if this had been walked on and it had fractured through, I wouldn't actually use the broken bit. But the bits that are okay, yeah, they're fine. And if it's particularly foul, you might want to chuck it. But otherwise, once it's heated out, with a bit of patience, you can undo all the seams. You can also open up that and split the two layers again, and then use them individually. So we're now going to make a POSI splint by a pattern method, and I've just got two paper towels stuck together with some sellotape as my pattern material. What we want to do is make a splint which starts somewhere around here, goes underneath the fingers and supports the thumb, but I want the thumb supported underneath the hand, and to do that I make a pattern which puts the thumb in a very odd position, but all will become clear. So this splint needs to end somewhere around there, so I'm just going to mark where I want to finish the splint. It's got to come about halfway up the forearm to give it the required strength. So I'm just marking halfway up the forearm all the way down the hand, and here just really just running it along. Sometimes the patient will have their fingers out like that and you just need to tuck them in. I'm just going to draw around the end, and I want to know where the thumb web is. So I've left a bit of extra material just to make a gutter up either side. I need to know how long the thumb is, so I'm going to mark it and where it starts. But instead of cutting out the thumb here, which you would logically think, I'm going to put it down here. In my mind, swinging that round so you can see what it will look like. One of the nice things about Exolite is it's very forgiving, so if you find that the splint is a little bit narrow somewhere, you can just give it a bit of a stretch. Again, if you end up with too much material, you can just fold it over or heat it and squash it in a little bit. So that is the pattern. I'm just going to cut that out. So with the leg splint, we were talking about how much it shrinks. This also will shrink, but it's over the somewhat smaller dimensions of this splint, we won't really notice that. The other thing, of course, with pattern making is that everybody's patterns are very individual. And as we saw with the leg splint, the material is folded over to form a nice edge, a nice hem. And when I do a pattern, I don't include the fold over. I put that on afterwards. Some people make a pattern, make them very much bigger than they actually need because it does include the fold over. So whichever thing works for you. I'm just going to cut that one up into a line with roughly with where the thumb web was. And then if you imagine that brought underneath, the hand is now in that kind of orientation. Right, now to transfer that to the plastic. If you remember the leg splint we made, and I've opened it out and taken all the reinforcement and all the Velcro off it, and I can put the pattern onto that and move it around until I've got the best economical use of this material. And you can see out of one leg I could make 2 of those and still have a bit left over for something else. I always cut wide so that I have the extra material for the turnover. And this stuff is quite hard to cut when it's 2 layers thick, and especially when it's been used already. I'm going to hack my way through it and then just warm it up a little bit by heating it up just very briefly, just that, just a few seconds, and it's just enough to make it a bit soft and floppy. And then I'll put my pattern on it, which has already got wet, but doesn't really matter. So that's on. I'm now going to cut with about 1 centimetre over from my pattern, and it's a lot easier to cut now because the material is quite soft. And those bits I'm going to use again as we did with the leg splint for reinforcement. So I'll put those in to warm up. Usually strips work better. Once it's cut out, that's my shape, I'm going to put it in the water, and if you see, the paper lifts straight off. So just simple toweling will lift straight off the plastic and won't get stuck to it. And once it's cut out, we don't need that. Unlike the leg, which was vaguely symmetrical, this is obviously sided, and this was made on Jackie's right hand. And it's important that the turn-up is on the underneath side of the splint and not on the side facing the patient's skin. So I want to turn it on that side, and I usually check with my own hand, right hand, that yes, that is the underneath of the splint. That the splint is going to be like that. So that is the underneath, and I don't want to be turning it up on that side because that will be against the body. A number of times I have made left splints for right hands. So I'm folding over these edges, rounding out the ends. I talked about this material being forgiving. Well, you can stretch it out and pull it until it takes on a familiar hand and arm shape. Right, it's going cold, so I need to cook it again just to get those turn-ups done. Again, using the rolling pin to get it all the way down. Again, if we wanted to, you could put your Velcro patches on now if you know where they're going to go, but we can do that later if necessary. Now the weak part of this splint is going to be here. That's where the wrist moves it, and it's most flexible. So if I'm going to reinforce this splint, especially if I need to apply load at the wrist, that is the place I need to put it. And contrary to intuition, it isn't there I want to put it, it's there, it's at the side. The side of the splint, make that tough, and that will make the splint rigid. You have to put much more material here to produce the same amount of rigidity. And also, the thumb can be a bit flexible as well. So I'm going to put a little bit of reinforcement in there, just to hold the thumb section up and give it some stiffness. As described, I'm going to put it down that on the side, put some reinforcement down the inside of that thumb. And again, I'm just going to flatten it out. The material is quite sticky, as we've seen before, and Jackie's got some stockinette on. You can also use crepe bandage. If you wrap crepe around it, you can stick it to that. And it's particularly if you're using this in theatre, where there's theatre dressings, the plastic will stick to that, you won't be able to take it off. So sometimes putting a crepe bandage, and especially if you can find one of a different colour, it's easier to cut it off and get it and not the theatre dressings underneath it. So put a crepe bandage on, stick the plastic to that, let it go off, and then you can cut the crepe bandage to take the splint off and put Velcro on it or whatever. So having warmed it up, all the seams are lying down quite well. I want to get the water out of this before it goes on. So that should flick the water out into the towel. I want to get this thumb bit in like that and just loosely mould it to the thumb, and then I can get this bit around the hand. Now you might need a bit of help if your patient isn't as cooperative. We're going to get into POSI, it's sticky. I'm sticking to the splint. I'm just going to get a bit of water on my hands just so that I can hold it without sticking. We want to get the wrist into about 30-35 degrees of extension. So at that angle there. I want to get the MCP joints into about 70 to 90. But often on a traumatized hand, you'll find that that is very difficult to do. So you do the best you can, and if necessary, come back and do it again later. And then we want to get the IP joints into extension if we can, and the thumb in a sort of functional position. And then it's waiting for it to cool. The killing can be speeded up with a fan or even wafting up cardboard at it. If the thumb isn't required, you don't need to immobilise the thumb, then simply dividing the splint along that line, or not putting that piece in to start with, and producing a nice rolled edge will make the splint fine, leaving the thumb free to mobilise. But it's quite important to bring it well in so that the thumb has some freedom to move. So once it's cooled and it's gone off, I'm just going to cut the stockinette or the crepe bandage off, and then the splint can be removed. The lining can now be removed. The soft lining can be put inside that to make it a bit more comfortable, or it can go onto the theatre dressings, which should be enough comfort. And then this can be held on with Velcro in our usual places, but you can put them anywhere. And this can also be bandaged on as well, which might be more appropriate in from a hand straight from theatre. This is the strap that really does the business and holds the hand down into the splint, so that needs to be fairly good and substantial. This one just stops it rattling around. This holds the fingers down onto the splint, and this one is important to keep the PIP joints into extension, and the thumb is just captured by that to stop it falling out. And now this beautiful splint that we've made.